Good evening, colleagues. This evening, I want to recognize the Deputy Vice-Chancellors, the Executive Deans of Faculty, our University Registrar. I also want to especially single out the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Law, Dr. Lynn Biggs, colleagues in the Faculty of Law, especially the Department of Public Law. I want to recognize in our midst the members of the legal profession that are here this evening. I also, in particular, want to single out Judge President Mbenenge, who is the president of the Eastern Cape. Welcome, Judge Mbenenge. I want to recognize all the professors that are here and all the members of the academy that are here this evening, members of senior management, our students, honored guests, family members, friends, and colleagues who are sharing in this celebration this evening. I am pleased to welcome you all to Professor Joanna Botha's inaugural lecture this evening on behalf of our university. A special warm welcome is also extended to Professor Botha's colleagues, particularly those in the Faculty of Law who have supported and encouraged her on this long journey. All of you, I am sure, take much pleasure in witnessing the realization of this great milestone in our colleagues' academic career, which in true academic spirit you would have helped to support and to nurture. I particularly wish to acknowledge and welcome Professor Botha's family and friends. I want to especially single out Professor Botha's husband, Mr. MC Botha, who the professor has told us that he is her most loyal supporter and her best friend. Thank you very much for that, MC. I also want to recognize, thank you colleagues, I want to recognize Professor Botha's children, Lauren and James Stevenson. I have learned that all three, MC, whom we all, many of us know, of course, and both the children are students at Nelson Mandela University, which might be some kind of a record in the annals of professors delivering inaugural lectures at Mandela University. Thanks for that, Joe. Her parents, Peter and Michelle Owen, who have always inspired Joe. Her siblings, Jackie, Simon, and Paula, who I understand are participating virtually at this lecture this evening. I want to recognize Professor Alex Brown, an associate professor in political and legal theory at the University of East Anglia in the UK, and a prominent hate scholar. We're going to hear more about hate scholars this evening. Professor Roseanne Kruger, a colleague and friend on the steering committee of the Law and Development Research Network, a research associate in the Faculty of Law at Mandela, and a professor of law at the University of Warwick in the UK. All Professor Botha's Mandela University's colleagues and beyond Nelson Mandela, not only in the faculty, but across the domains of science that have supported her and collaborated her to get to where Jo is today. The support of family, friends, and colleagues is at the center of our success as individuals and as professionals. Friends and family keep us grounded. They are our safe harbors, our shepherds, our mentors, and at times they are our disciplinarians. This evening we acknowledge and support and salute all of your various contributions in a long academic journey that Jo has walked up to this moment. On behalf of our university, Nelson Mandela University, we thank you for supporting and encouraging Professor Botha. We share in your joy and pride at this ultimate academic and professional honor we are witnessing here tonight. Mandela University aims to be a values-driven and transformative institution, and we take genuine pride in our engaged scholarship, which seeks to co-create groundbreaking African-purposed solutions to complex global societal challenges. This is part of a broader strategy to contribute more meaningfully to alleviating human precarity. Professor Botha's work resonates strongly with this focus of our university. The research she has undertaken and is doing, and the topic of her lecture tonight, adds decisively to the body of work which promotes our better understanding of the meaning of hate and why people hate, to enhance law's capacity to construct meaningful change, and by extension, advance the realization of a more inclusive South Africa and of a more inclusive world. Professor Botha's work is scaffolded by formidable academic accomplishments, an exemplary teaching pedigree, professional and publications record, as well as various forms of engaged scholarships and collaborations. In this regard, it is important that we mention that in 2023, Professor Botha served a term as an acting judge of the Eastern Cape High Court. This is a statement to her enduring commitment to expanding the body of work in her field and discipline, while making sure that it finds practical expression and relevance in our efforts to contribute to the flourishing of our country and continent. It is in this context that Professor Botha's work assumes such importance as a timely reminder that South Africa does indeed have tremendous potential and can be the architect of its own future. Professor Botha, we are honored that at this point in your career, we have chosen to remain part of Nelson Mandela University family. We are proud of your accomplishments, Professor, and we are eagerly looking forward to listening to your lecture tonight. We congratulate you on this outstanding achievement. Being promoted to the level of full professor is the definitive affirmation of your scholarship. I now request the Executive Dean, Dr. Lynn Biggs, to introduce Professor Joanna Botha. I thank you. Mazane Tol.
Thank you, VC. Good evening, Madam Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mutwa, Deputy Vice-Chancellors present here this evening, Executive Deans, Senior Academics, members of the faculty that I can see here, colleagues, students, friends and family, and of course, our distinguished lecturer, Professor Joanna Botha. I would also like to extend a special greeting to Joanna's guests that were not already mentioned by the VC this evening. Professor Sam Edelman, Professor Jean Null, who is the chair of Hate Crimes Working Group, Professor Avinash Gavanji, who is attending online, and Professor Vivian Levac, who is also attending online, and of course all of those who are also viewing online. For those of you, I'm Lynn Biggs, and I really welcome you there this evening as well. It is with great pleasure that I stand before you this evening to introduce a distinguished scholar whose contributions to the legal body of knowledge have been nothing short of remarkable. Prof. Botha, a member of the Department of Public Law at the Faculty of Law, Nelson Mandela University, has not only exemplified excellence in academia, but has also been a driving force in shaping legal discourse in South Africa and beyond. Drawing from an illustrious academic journey, Joanna brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to this evening's lecture. With the Doctor of Laws degree, conferred in 2016, her doctoral thesis, Hate Speech as a Limitation to Freedom of Expression, stands as a testament to her commitment to advancing legal scholarship in critical areas of societal concern. Throughout her distinguished career, Prof. Botha has not only excelled in research, but has also garnered recognition for her pedagogical excellence, receiving awards such as the Emerging Teacher of the Year Award and the Excellent Teacher of the Year in the Faculty of Law. Her dedication to nurturing the next generation of legal minds is truly commendable. She introduced the very successful moot court elective as part of our LLB curriculum a few years back, dedicating herself to the training of our top students in advocacy skills and exposing them to the practical application of the law. Over the years in academia, Joanna has been pioneering in her approaches to the sharing of knowledge with her human rights law students. Her passion for teaching is clearly evident by the praise and admiration of her students. Joanna also lives by the pay it forward philosophy, in that not only does she eagerly contribute as a supervisor or promoter for undergraduate and postgraduate students, but she has also volunteered and willingly dedicated her time to facilitating research hubs at lunchtime on a Friday every second or third week for all our postgraduate students and staff of the faculty, where she shares tips and experiences for those on their postgraduate journey. However, it's not Professor Botha's it is Professor Botha's groundbreaking research that truly sets her apart as a trailblazer in the legal field. Her CV lists numerous articles published in accredited journals, book chapters in peer-reviewed books, encyclopedia entries in peer-reviewed encyclopedia, papers presented at international and national conferences, chapters in textbooks, comments on draft legislation, research affiliations with international partners, numerous awards, and the list goes on and on. Her research work, particularly in hate crimes and hate speech legislation, has been instrumental in shaping legal frameworks both nationally and internationally. Tonight, and on the day that she received notification that she has received a C2 NRF rating, Prof. Botha will be sharing insights from her latest research, which delves into the normative basis of hate and its implications for legal regulation. Her lecture will explore the intricacies of hate crimes and hate speech legislation, drawing from her experience in constitutional law and human rights. Considering recent developments, including the passing of the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Act, Professor Botha's lecture promises to shed light on the complexities of hate regulation within the South African context. By examining the intersections of law, morality, and psychology, she will provide valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities inherent in addressing hate offences. So it is my privilege to welcome Professor Botha, my colleague and friend, to the podium. Joanna and I have a long history. Our paths crossed fleetingly in the mid-1990s when we were both young aspiring attorneys. It was only in 2004 that our true friendship really blossomed. Joanna commenced working at the then PE Technikon in 2003, and I started in 2004. We were both contract lecturers at the time, and our offices were next door to each other. I see Daryl Newton here smiling at me because his office was down the passage. Look at us now, Joanna, 20 years later, and what a wonderful journey we have had at Nelson Mandela University together. I'm truly blessed and honored to have the privilege to introduce you to the audience this evening. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to a scholar whose dedication to the pursuit of knowledge and justice continues to inspire us all. Joanna.
Madam Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, JP, Registrar, Madam Dean, Deans of other faculties, Professors, colleagues, and honoured guests. It is my pleasure to present you my inaugural lecture, which I've entitled, after much deliberation I might add, The Injustice of Sanctioning Hate. Now, in law, hatred can take the form of both hate speech and a hate crime. Although both concepts include the word hate in their labels, they are distinct phenomena and should not be confused. South Africa's Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, B9 of 2018, which was recently passed by both Houses of Assembly and signed by the President on the 6th of May 2024, becoming Act 16 of 2023, and which I shall call the Hate Act, regulates both hate crimes and the offence of hate speech. The date of commencement of the Act is uncertain, which is a pity, as its promulgation is very overdue, given that it was first published in 2018, over 6 years ago. Indeed, the introduction of a composite framework to regulate hate as a criminal offence is much needed in our country. But unfortunately, there are a number of problems with the Act's conceptual framework. I am unable to do justice to all of these in this lecture, so I confine myself to a few problems, specifically the framing of the hate crime and hate speech offences, although it is the latter which is more problematic, the number of listed victim groups in the Act, and whether it is justifiable for the criminal law to regulate cases of hate speech, given the value that freedom of expression plays in our constitutional project. This is also linked to what we understand by hate as a concept, what its core characteristics might be, and why people hate. It's my thesis that if the law is to have any chance of achieving its main objectives, namely to give effect to our international obligations, to combat prejudice and intolerance, and to prevent hate crimes and hate speech, then a clear appreciation of what hate means across disciplines is required, so that together we can work to address the very serious social problem that the enactment of intergroup hatred poses to our constitutional democracy. So the lecture will take the following form. In part one, and mainly for the benefit of the non-hate scholars in the room, I think there are a few, I shall distinguish between hate speech and a hate crime, using a few practical examples, and then explain how these two phenomena have been regulated in South African law up until now. In part two, I move to the Hate Act and discuss its objectives, how it defines both a hate crime and a hate speech offence, the increased sanctions that courts are mandated to impose, and the way in which the Act intends to enhance our entire criminal justice system, from policing to prosecution and beyond, for the management of hate offences. During this analysis, I critique aspects of the Hate Act in relation to both hate crimes and the offence of hate speech. I use this as a critique for part three, where I spend some time, thanks to my colleagues in other disciplines, exploring the meaning of hate, its characteristics, and the reasons why people hate. This analysis, I believe, is linked to the question of whether the Hate Act is able to achieve its objectives, and indeed, even though law is never a quick fix, whether it is always justifiable for the law to criminalize hate. So I then move to part one. As you can see, the nature of hate speech versus hate crimes and the difference between these two. So hate speech, in short, consists of words, speech, or a speech act, such as the waving of the old South African flag, and I won't get into the DA ad, or a poster, or the publication of a cartoon, which advocates hatred on the basis of a prohibited ground, such as race, sexual orientation, or religion, and there are many, and which causes the incitement of harm. Now, the harm incited could be direct in the form of psychological or physical harm to the person targeted, but need not take place immediately after the speech is communicated. Very often, in fact, the harm occurs much later on, especially in cases where the advocacy of hatred against a particular target group has become part of the accepted social rhetoric or social fabric. But hate speech also causes indirect harm. This type of harm generally occurs in two scenarios. Firstly, where everyone who belongs to the actual victims group feels that the hate monger's vitriol is directed at them too, and that they are not welcome in society. And secondly, where the speech threatens to undermine the type of society which our Constitution envisages, namely a diverse one, which accommodates a wide variety of beliefs, races, cultures, religions, ethnic groups, and languages, and which respects the rights to equality and human dignity. In this respect, it is important to note that our Constitutional Court regards dignity as including not only our individual dignity, but also our group identity, plus what is known as the right to be different, and the assurance that we can all live and work together without the need to face hostility, violence, discrimination, or exclusion. And it is for these reasons that the Constitution specifically excludes hate speech from the ambit of constitutional protection, recognizing too that it is the fuel which incites acts of terrorism, extremism, and genocide, and which certainly undermines the integrity of a democracy. Xenophobic hate speech, which occurs all too regularly in this country, illustrates these principles well. Many of you may have heard of Operation Dudula, which is an anti-migrant South African organization, and which recently unsuccessfully challenged its right to contest the upcoming elections as a political party. The organization was formed in 2021 after the riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. My apologies, this needs to just come back. Lost it. The joys of media, there we go. And has since spread countrywide. That's Operation Dudula. Now, Operation Dudula's core ideology is anti-migrant. Incidentally, and this is where the interdisciplinary thing comes in, migration and the displacement of people is a common problem worldwide, as is xenophobic hate speech, with migration caused by factors such as war, socio-economic deprivation, climate change, and internal strife, many of the triggers that cause people to hate one another. But to return to Operation Dudula, Dudula is an isiZulu word meaning to force out, and the organization is known for its public calls for the mass deportation of undocumented migrants, the blocking of healthcare services to immigrants, and the forced removal of foreign businesses via vigilantism. This call is based mainly on South African nationalism, with the slogan South Africa First predominant, or South Africans First, and the belief that foreign nationals are the root cause of South Africa's economic hardship, poverty, and its challenges to deliver economic services, socio-economic services. Now, common rhetoric linked to this group includes tweets on their Twitter handle such as this, and you can read it for yourself. But this tweet was published on Operation Dudula's Twitter handle alongside photographs of a person described as a Mozambican and a serial rapist. And then also to note, for Operation Dudula, the use of the word ghosts to refer to foreigners is common, along with false claims about the number of undocumented foreign nationals in South Africa. Another example is this tweet. Again, I'm going to ask you to read it for yourself. But this was accompanied by a video depicting a crowd assaulting a foreign national who was trying to access healthcare services at the Kalafong hospital. The tweet glorified the assault and encouraged others to participate in the attack. These two examples of ongoing tweets, assaults, acts of incitement, and criminal behavior by members of Operation Dudula, and I have a picture of them for you, who are reported to arrive at sites occupied by foreigners dressed in military uniform nogal, can now be applied to the concepts underpinning the definition of hate speech. You'll recall, I hope, that I mentioned that the harm incited by hate speech can either be direct or indirect or both, that it need not be physical, and that it does not always occur immediately following the speech. So when hate speech is directed at the victimized foreign individual in my example, that victim would inevitably experience direct psychological harm in the form of emotional scarring and fear, whereas direct physical harm is also possible and would include the looting of the foreigner's spaza shop or a personal assault or arson. Direct harm in these forms could occur either immediately after the verbal attack or sometime later, hence why we say hate speech leads up to genocides. Now, indirect harm to the victim's group is also possible and could also be psychological or physical. In relation to indirect psychological harm, the research shows that hate speech targets not only the individually selected victim, but all people who are like the victim. So the message conveyed to foreigners by Operation Dudula's tweets would be, you are not welcome here. This could happen to you too. You are the other, get out, and so on. This message would clearly cause fear, anxiety, and distress to the entire group. Indirect physical harm is also possible in clear cases of violence and harassment against an entire group of foreigners. And as I've already explained, a third form of indirect harm is the damage caused to the societal collective and the desire to live in harmony regardless of our group identity. So let's have a look then at the current regulation of hate speech in South Africa. This is pre the Act. Excuse me, I'm just going to have some water. At present, in South Africa, and pending the promulgation of the Act, hate speech is regulated mainly as a human rights violation in terms of a very long piece of legislation called the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act 4 of 2000, which, for obvious reasons, we shortened to the Equality Act, or as some people like to call it, PEPUDA. I hope my students are listening. This Act's hate speech provision, Section 10, subsection 1, previously defined hate speech very broadly as including hurtful speech on the basis of a prohibited ground. But it was declared unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court in 2021 in Kwelani versus the South African Human Rights Commission. I think, Jean, you gave evidence in that case, if I'm not mistaken. The court ordered that pending amendment by the legislature, hate speech should be more narrowly defined to constitute speech on a prohibited ground that could reasonably be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be harmful or to incite harm and to promote or propagate hatred. I hope the linguists and lawyers are listening about how important language is in the law, ands, ors, etc. The legislature has since enacted an amendment to the Equality Act using this exact definition, with the result that a new Section 10(1) now applies. Now, as I shall indicate shortly, the definition of the hate speech offence, the crime, as opposed to the human rights violation in the Equality Act, is very similar to that in the Equality Act, which for me is a concern, mainly because the Hate Act also contains what I would call an objective form of mens rea, we like Latin in law, which means intention, to be guilty of the offence of hate speech. In particular, whilst the Act requires that the hate monger intend to publish the material in issue, the test in the Act for whether the hate monger actually intended the material to be harmful and to propagate hatred is an objective one. Now, this is no problem for a human rights statute, in my view, which aims to address the effects of discrimination and hate speech and which doesn't usually require intention. But I think it is an issue for a statute creating a criminal offence. Now, I was explaining, before I went into the problematic new definition, how the Equality Act regulates hate speech. The Act creates equality courts, and some of the academics in the room can tell you that these are sadly very underutilized in South Africa for various reasons, and authorizes them to impose a number of remedial remedies on persons who engage in hate speech. These remedies include the payment of damages to groups harmed by the speech, takedown orders, apologies, remedial education for perpetrators, and so on. Importantly, the Equality Act does not create a hate speech offence. It regulates hate through a human rights framework. Section 2, subsection 2 of the Act does, however, say that an Equality Act may refer an appropriate case to the Director of Public Prosecutions for prosecution in terms of the existing common law or other legislation. Now, there are three main problems with this position. One, the common law legal framework for the prosecution of hate speech with respect is dated. The prosecuting authorities usually opt to charge offenders with crimen injuria, which is designed to remedy individual dignity, the harm to one's individual dignity, and in my view, has not been appropriately adapted to deal with the harm that group-based hatred causes. Secondly, the sentencing framework for persons found guilty of crimen injuria is not well established, and this results in an array of sentences being imposed on offenders, from suspended sentences to fines and to jail terms. Thirdly, the existing statutory framework for the criminalization of hate speech is fragmented. So, in terms of existing legislation, well, what legislation? Because we've actually got legislative hate speech offences in many pieces of legislation, including the Films and Publications Act and the more recently enacted Cybercrimes Act. It is also problematic, I venture to suggest, that the definitions of hate speech as a crime in these pieces of legislation are inconsistent. Plus, the acts all impose a different range of sentences on convicted offenders. And this problem, in my view, is likely to be exacerbated when the Hate Act comes into force, because it is not clear which act will apply in which circumstance, which act will take precedence over the other, and plus both the Hate Act, which is coming into effect soon, we hope, and the Cybercrimes Act both regulate electronic communications containing forms of hate speech. Legal certainty will undoubtedly be compromised unless the legislature aligns the various pieces of hate-based legislation in our statutory regime to create a more rational framework. I move now to hate crimes. So I'm going to put that up, and you can see it while I speak. The following is that hate crime laws can take various forms. But a hate crime is generally defined as an existing crime which is motivated by intolerance, bias, prejudice, or hatred towards the victim of the crime because of the victim's group-based identity characteristics. There are two main elements. One, the underlying criminal act, which could be murder or rape, or any other crime for that matter, except crimen injuria. And secondly, a requirement that the perpetrator select the victim based on group status. And this is the bias or prejudice requirement. Now, commonly protected characteristics worldwide in hate crime legislation include race, gender, disability, and religion. Just like with hate speech, it's all group-based. And the consequence of being convicted of a hate crime is one that the perpetrator is going to be labeled in the criminal justice system as a hate offender, almost the same as we see for sexual offenders. And then secondly, an increased sentence can be imposed on the perpetrator where there is physical violence and so on. And this increased sentence is justified on the basis that hate crimes, to use Paul Agansky's words, hurt more. And I'll deliberate on that soon. As to the difference between hate crimes and hate speech, the hate crimes framework penalizes crimes which are committed with a prejudiced motive, whereas the offense of hate speech punishes the publication of the hateful expression, which is not a criminal act per se, to speak. There are, however, common features between the two. The most obvious commonality, as I mentioned, is with both group victimhood is key, because the target of the speech, or the victim of the crime, is selected based on group identity. So unlike the victims of parallel crimes, the so-called ordinary crimes, if you will, hate crime victims are not selected because of their individuality or who they are, but for what they represent, usually depicted as the other. And they're not random either, contrary to what people might say, apart from the odd one here and there. And this is why hate speech and hate crimes are often described as message or symbolic crimes. The crime is directed at everyone who belongs to the same group as the victim. And in this sense, hate crimes should be regarded as mechanisms of power aimed at reinforcing social hierarchies through threats of violence, or insidious messages of hate directed at groups of persons who are different and who are stigmatized. Indeed, hate crimes, and I use the term broadly here, occur in order to remind those targeted and their broader societal group of their proper position in society and are a means to perpetuate social inequalities. As Barbara Perry explains, hate crime theory contextualizes doing difference. It is important to bear in mind, however, that victimhood is not static, but historically, socially, politically, and contextually contingent. In other words, depending upon the societal context, new forms of group-based vulnerability can develop, bearing in mind, too, that people are often targeted on the basis of more than one group characteristic, which we call intersectionality. So, and excuse me, I'm going to have some more water. Nobody told me that this is a thirsty job. So let me go back to Operation Dudula, the xenophobic example I used earlier. BBC Africa Eye and other news agencies cite the case of a Nigerian market trader, a foreign national, by the way, who had been granted South African citizenship and could even vote, who was the target of a raid by Operation Dudula members in Johannesburg in 2023. His shop was looted, he was tasered and assaulted, and his clothes destroyed. These crimes were committed by members of Operation Dudula, who were dressed in military gear, as you can see in the picture over there, in the trousers that the man is wearing, and who were reported to have shouted, "You must go to Nigeria. We are Dudula. We are South African." Again, I clicked on the wrong place. So you can have a look at that picture, and I'll take one sec. Gives me a chance to catch my breath. There are, of course, many other examples of such incidents in South Africa, and I've just chosen this one to demonstrate the principles. But there are very few cases where perpetrators and instigators have been successfully prosecuted. This is a serious problem for us. Hate crimes, as I said, do not only take the form of xenophobic violence. Examples abound and include the targeting of people belonging to religious groups, specific races, and crimes committed against the LGBTQI+ community. So, how then do we deal with the Hate Act? What is going to happen with the Hate Act? So up until recently, South African law has not addressed hate crimes as a distinct category of crime. Instead, offenders have been charged, so this is now before the Hate Act comes into effect, with the base crime, such as assault, theft, whatever. And then if convicted, the perpetrator's motive for committing the crime is used to enhance the sentence imposed. And the JP will tell you that motive is not usually an element of the crime, and so will my friend over there, who was the Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions in this province. Now, the Hate Crimes Act will change this position. A hate crime will be recognized as a separate category of crime with its own procedural rules and with enhanced or increased sentences for hate offenders. Thus, the Hate Act will do far more than introduce a hate speech offence and hate crimes into our law. It actually creates a much-needed framework overall for the regulation of hate. For example, it provides for the prevention of hate crimes by promoting awareness of the prohibition. It provides for the coordinated implementation, application, and administration of the Act, training of members of the police force, prosecutors, judicial officers, who need to understand the impact of hate crimes on victims and their families and friends. It provides for the gathering and recording of hate data, just like in relation to sexual offenders. And it provides for the combating of hate crimes and hate speech in a coordinated manner. Now, this approach is in line with foreign best practice and shows a sound appreciation of the need to link the regulation of hate crimes to their prevention and prosecution and the collection of data and reporting. It is critical, however, that the objectives of the Act be aligned with both the hate speech and hate crime constructs, and specifically the harm caused to vulnerable groups. In my view, a rational connection between the regulatory framework and its objective is needed, and this involves a sound appreciation of what we mean by hate, the harm caused by intergroup hatred, the reasons why we hate one another, and how this can be remedied. So, let us then have a look at various definitions in the Hate Act, and this is where some of the problems come up. So I'm not going to read this in detail, but it pretty much tells us how a hate crime is going to be defined. There have been some changes to the recent bill that was last published and which has now become the Act, but you'll see exactly what I mentioned earlier. An underlying offence, okay, not crimen injuria. Why? Because that would probably be under the hate speech offence, and committed on the basis of prejudice or intolerance based on group characteristics. And you can see that's quite broadly defined. It could be a family member, it could be somebody that you support, etc. Now, a bit of a problem is that the Act lists 16 group characteristics, which range from age, albinism, language, nationality, political affiliation, occupation, all the way to skin color. Any person who commits an underlying offense on the basis of one or more of these grounds will be guilty of a hate crime and liable to an enhanced sanction. As I said, that person's record is also going to be stated that they are now a hate offender. So what about sanction? This is where we go to Section 6 of the Act. And again, I'm not going to read the provision because that would be terribly boring. But what you can see on the slide is that you will get an aggravated sanction, an enhanced sanction, where the crime, the hate crime, caused damage to property, etc., physical or other injury, obviously also murder, and loss of income or support. And a combined reading, in my view, of this provision and the hate crime definition is that South Africa will end up using what we call a hybrid hate crime model to frame our hate crime offence. And this model is a combination of 3 different recognized hate crime models, which I'm not going to bore you with, I promise, and which require that victims be selected because of their identity, that there be prejudice towards the victim as an element of the offence, and an enhanced sentence to be imposed on perpetrators. And the advantage of this model is that it gives our courts the authority to declare an existing offence committed with a biased motive as aggravated both in law and at the sentencing phase. Up until now, remember, we could only do it at the sentencing phase. So symbolically, it's really important that you are now convicted of a hate crime and you go onto this register and we can now monitor what's going on. Moving on, however, it's important to note that whilst the offence is labelled a hate crime, hate is not the threshold for the offence. So I'll take it back one, and you will see there that it is prejudice or intolerance. So all you have to do is to demonstrate that the offender was motivated by prejudice or intolerance to the victim based on the victim's identity, those 16 listed grounds, and that the commission of the crime actually occurred because of that person's characteristics. Now, I think this wording creates 3 potential problems. 1, how on earth is the prosecution going to prove that the crime was motivated by the offender's prejudice? So we've done workshops on this, JP, you would remember, but how are you going to prove that? Well, this is usually done with reference to the context in which the underlying crime was committed and the power relationship between the offender and the victim. Very often, the fact that the perpetrator was aligned to a particular movement, known to support fundamentalism, for example, would be relevant, as would evidence of any hate chants or signs that were displayed at the time when the offence was committed. Okay, so that's the first problem, and I think I've answered it, I hope, as to how we deal with it. And you would have seen with the Operation Tulula, the signs, etc. Secondly, it's often asked why the trigger for the hate crime offence is bias as opposed to hate, which is the threshold for the hate speech offence. And I know that you, Alex, have spent a lot of time looking at the difference between hate and bias, and we're honoured to have you here. But the answer is that it's not unusual to lower the hate threshold for hate crimes as opposed to the crime of hate speech. This is because with a hate crime, the underlying conduct is already a criminal offence, and the prosecution will be required to prove all the elements of that offence beyond a reasonable doubt, plus the biased motive. And secondly, hate crimes originate in US jurisprudence, and in the US, First Amendment treats speech very, very differently to conduct. They put speech on a pedestal, and this is why they require a very strict test for laws that limit anything in public discourse. And I think it's probably as a result of this that we see different tests for hate crimes and hate speech as well. So that was problem number 2. Problem number 3, I think the legislature has been far too inclusive by listing 16 group characteristics in the Act. In my view, given the entirely new framework which the Act introduced, this move renders the practical implementation of the Act almost impossible. And then it has the potential, I think, to undermine the law's effectiveness, and in turn, the protection and the symbolic value it extends to the victims of hate. Nonetheless, the introduction of a legislated hate crime, along with a criminal justice system that is designed to enhance the prevention of hate crimes, is welcome and is long overdue in this country. I move now to Section 4 of the Act, which introduces the hate speech offence. All right, this is a bit more controversial. Again, you can see it on the screen. and you will see I've bolded a couple of words for you. Any person who intentionally, bonus, there's intention, publishes, propagates, advocates, makes available, or communicates, that's very low down, threshold, anything to one or more persons in a manner that could reasonably be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to, 1, be harmful or to incite harm, and 2, promote or propagate hatred, will be guilty of the offence of hate speech if it occurs on one or more of the listed grounds. But then the Act goes further, and it also includes the electronic communication of hate speech as a hate offence in the Hate Act, even though the cybercrimes actually deals with electronic communications. Now, you will see that it uses pretty much the same test for what a hate speech offence might be if put out there online, except there's an extra requirement. You also have to know that it constitutes hate speech up front, which is very strange. Why would you add a different requirement, a separate requirement to online hate speech, which, quite frankly, is pretty much the same as hate speech that occurs not online? And across the world, we say, treat them the same, deal with it as a mode of communication. Right, so you might be asking, are there any defences? And oh my word, there are. And sadly for us, the legislature has pretty much taken what's in the Equality Act and reproduced it in the Hate Crimes Act. And this, quite frankly, I've written on this, but it's seriously problematic because I actually don't know what the interpretation and proselytizing or espousing of a religious conviction, tenet does not advocate hatred that constitutes incitement to cause harm based on one or more of the grounds actually means. Okay? And this is creating a defense. And quite frankly, you'll also see that one in C is horrible. We've all written about this before and said, sort out the defenses. We also do not know if these, who will bear the onus of proving these defenses. It's not specifically stated in the Act, which will be a problem that the courts will have to deal with. Right, so I realize now that I put this one onto the next slide. Sorry about that, because I couldn't fit it onto the previous one. So yeah, there's D for those of you who are interested in the wording. Now, the law says that if you are found guilty of a hate speech offence, you're liable to a fine or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 5 years, or to both a fine and such imprisonment. Now, the wording is a vast improvement on earlier versions of the Act, but is still problematic. Firstly, regarding the formulation of the offence. I've mentioned already there's a problem with intention here. Yes, you must intend to publish, but what about intention elsewhere? It seems that there's an objective intention test there. And that, in my view, is exacerbated by the requirement that communicate is included. It should be a stronger word, such as propagate or advocate. And then it does not require that both the promotion of hatred and incitement to cause harm are cumulative elements of the offence. It is sufficient if the speech is harmful and promotes hatred. In other words, incitement is not part of the crime itself. My comments very briefly are that the framing of a hate speech offence must recognise that the intervention of the criminal law to regulate speech is a drastic measure, and that its use must be justified on the basis that the speech targeted causes a significant risk of harm. International hate speech jurisprudence is clear that where hate speech is criminalized, the speaker should be convicted only if the requisite mens rea is present, which includes the promotion of hatred and incitement to cause harm. The mere communication of a message that promotes hatred and is harmful, I think, sets the bar too low. Plus, to be constitutional. Any law that limits freedom of expression, and here we're going to section 36 for the lawyers around, must be reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society, taking into account various factors such as the nature and importance of the right limited, the nature and extent of that limitation, whether there is a rational connection between the law and its purpose, whether the provision is capable of achieving its purpose, and this is where we need the help of other disciplines, and whether there are less restrictive measures to achieve the Act's objectives. In other words, a proportional balance must be struck between the right limited, freedom of expression, and the rights protected, dignity and equality. And this can only be achieved if the measure is tightly drafted with strict mens rea requirements and the inclusion of all hate speech elements. So I think a constitutional challenge is likely, but in any event, it's clear that we're going to need prosecutorial training and judicial office training, police training, to understand exactly what type of conduct would constitute an offence. And core factors to be considered would be, who's the speaker? The more powerful the speaker, the more dangerous the speech. Who's targeted? And to whom is the speech directed? What is the content of that speech? And is the audience likely to react now or later? The context in light of prevailing social and political circumstances. And here it's really important that we have evidence of that context. You cannot, as AFRI Forum tried to do, go to court and try and have a specific song declared to be hate speech in no context at all, and not offer any evidence of that context. Everyone asked me that question, why is that song no longer hate speech? Well, it's not. It was on the basis of that particular case. Then you need to look at the reach of the speech and its manner of dissemination. How far did it go? And there must be a high risk of harm to the status and well-being of the target group in society. Remembering, of course, that actual committed harm is not necessary, but there must at least be a very good possibility that the speech will incite harm against the target group and damage the communal good. Second problem I've already mentioned is the difference between the criminalization of electronic hate speech in the Act and ordinary offline hate speech. The third is this terribly, terribly long list of characteristics. I had a discussion with Deputy Minister John Jeffries at a conference recently, and he said, man, we've got to include everybody. Sorry, John Jeffries. But really, I think this is overambitious, all right? Then our defenses are terribly vaguely worded. And finally, I suppose it's the moral question of the criminalization of hate. And this is where the philosophers and the psychologists can help us. And especially in those so-called gray areas where it's not clear whether a particular speech form constitutes criminal hate speech, whether in fact a perpetrator was motivated by hatred, and whether it's justifiable to criminalize a perpetrator for hating the other, especially when there is doubt about whether the hatred felt against the targeted victim is perfectly justifiable in our context, given our political circumstances, our history, and our socio-economic context. And that, of course, brings me to the final part of this lecture. And I must confess that this is where I'm slightly out of my depth, because I'm not a psychologist. I did study philosophy, but a very, very long time ago. So I'm looking at you, Pat. And it's why I think that we really need to do interdisciplinary work on this field. So what do we mean by hate? If you go to the English dictionary, it's going to tell you the verb hate is to feel an intense or violent dislike for or hostility towards someone or something or a specific concept. The noun hatred, taking you back to Grammar 101, has a similar meaning, except that it is defined as the actual feeling of intense dislike or aversion that we experience in relation to the object, person, or idea that we hate. Now, hate's first appearance as a legal concept can be traced back to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or the I Code, of 1965, which required states parties, including us, to criminalize racial superiority or hatred. Interestingly, this convention was drafted as a response to apartheid and what was happening in South Africa and in other parts of the world. Hate also appears in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, which provides that hate speech is not included in the ambit of freedom of expression. And note, especially in the I Code, racial superiority of hatred. The International Convention on Civil and Political Rights also specifically means national racial hatred. So it seems that in both treaties which we've ratified, hatred is closely aligned to hatred on the grounds of race. And this is in line with the work of one of the world's very first hate speech scholars, Mari Matsuda, who mainly used examples of racial hate speech to illustrate what types of speech could potentially fall within the boundaries of the concept. Since then, there have been many moves by her and others, however, to extend hatred beyond mere racial hatred. And at the moment at the I Code, we're grappling with whether racial hatred includes xenophobic hatred, whether racial can also include religious hatred. There's actually no international treaty in the world that regulates religious hatred as a concept, which is very interesting. Now, hate speech jurisprudence, going back to very famous cases of R versus Andrews and Kierstra, Canadian cases, characterize hate just like those dictionary definitions that I mentioned a moment ago. And they call it an emotion. But is hate an emotion? And if it isn't, what is it? If it is an emotion, how is it different from anger and revenge? And why should this be of concern to the law and to lawmakers? The reality, of course, is that law does not exist in a vacuum and has to set appropriate standards and align to our moral code. But we can't do it alone. We need the assistance of the experts in other disciplines, sociology, Madam VC, psychology, many of my colleagues here, philosophy, linguistics, looking at the language, ghosts, criminology, and others. So whilst the law focuses on the legal implications and consequences of hate-motivated actions, hate in psychology and other disciplines examines the emotional and cognitive processes underlying hate and how it impacts us, our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior. And so I believe that collaboration is necessary. I've recently learned, for example, thanks to the psychologists, and I'm nearly done, that hate could be a syndrome, an attitude, an emotion, a sentiment, or all or more of these, if you know what the difference is. It's more likely, though, I believe, that hate should be classified as a sentiment because hatred is normally sustained and developed over a long period of time in response to somebody who has treated us badly consistently or to something that we regard as bad or evil. And so hate is different, I understand, to the emotions of anger or rage, which are usually fleeting and not sustained. So hate lasts longer, and it's developed when we've been mistreated or humiliated on an ongoing basis, or where a person's deliberate actions have become an obstruction to our goals, or where the hated target is regarded as being morally deficient, or where the target is feared or considered a threat, especially where there are constrained socioeconomic conditions, as in this country. And then there's our friend Aristotle. Do you guys remember Aristotle? Who differentiated anger from hate in that anger is customarily felt towards individuals only, whereas hatred may be felt towards whole classes of people. Similarly, more recent research shows that intergroup hatred is also instigated by events that advance or even threaten the in-group as opposed to the out-group. So what happens when people hate? What are the consequences of that? There's evidence that when people hate, that they usually have low levels of control over the target's behavior. And this elicits a sense of helplessness and fear and a feeling of powerlessness. all of which are generally triggered by the fact that the individual who hates is afraid of the hate target. Hate also lingers, and it makes a relationship with the target very difficult in the future. And it can result in the goal to eliminate or undermine, in the case of intergroup hatred, people who belong to the outgroup from one's environment and from society, so that that target can be eliminated. And sometimes we do this physically as well. Think of the Berlin Wall. Think of apartheid. Think of the ghettos. Think of the Gaza Strip. Okay? We put these barriers in place as well so that we can other that particular society and so that we don't have to interact with them. Trump's wall also comes to mind. So it's very difficult, I think, to overcome hate, because when people hate, the research shows that they draw others to their cause. They don't want to be alone. Come on, you must also hate like me. All right? So hate becomes fed and sometimes ingrained across generations and shared by group members. And the result is that we other ourselves from people that we don't know, all right, or interact with, and the more barriers we create, the less likely we get to know those people anyway. So if we're going to enact laws to criminalize hatred, in my view, quite frankly, we need to understand what this is all about, and we can't work alone. And so I suppose at the end of the day, the questions that I pose are, can hatred be intentional? And is it always bad to hate? Especially when the hate may very well be justified, given the abuse that one has experienced or that one's family members have experienced. And on top of that, how do we overcome hatred? Luckily for us, there's one simple answer, is that it's okay to hate, but it's bad to enact hate, to speak it or to do it. But in the South African context, in conclusion, it's important that we appreciate the implications of the criminalization of hate on our law, on our constitutional principles, and the Constitution's transformative agenda. It is also critical that we explore the meaning of intentionality, consciousness, in relation to the acting out of hatred for both hate speech and a hate crime. In my view, this inquiry, where there's still lots more research to be done, including empirical research, I might add, lawyers don't like empirical research, and the reality that legal certainty is instrumental in ensuring that people understand the law and are able to circumscribe their behavior appropriately and justifying the imposition of sanctions upon hate offenders. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is me. And I end it with our lovely end slide of change the world, which is what we all hope to do. Thank you very much to all of you for listening to me and for dealing with the ponderings that I've had to deal with over the past couple of years. Thank you.
Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Deans, colleagues, esteemed guests, friends and family of Professor Botha. Good evening, goeienaand, molweni. As we draw this inaugural lecture to a close, it's my privilege to offer a few words of thanks and reflection. So let me extend my gratitude towards our newly inaugurated professor, Professor Botha. Of course, this makes it also very special for me tonight, Joanne, because I've known you and MC for many years, and we've also kind of first crossed paths at the old P Technicon, as Lynn said. So it makes it very special for me to do this vote of thanks for you on this special evening. So Professor Botha, your insightful presentation has enlightened us and provided us with a deeper understanding of the justice or the injustice of sanctioning hate. Your work not only advances knowledge in your field of study, but also highlights the importance of the diversity in the meaning of the concept hate speech. The lecture explored the normative basis of hate as it relates to an inter- and transdisciplinary notion of the concept. It provided a broad-based understanding of the hate regulation that can best be implemented in the legal system to identify what hate means and also to understand why people hate. Your lecture also enabled us to understand the moral limits of the law and to understand that legal certainty is instrumental in ensuring that people understand the law and the imposition of appropriate sanctions on hate offenders. These insights are not only relevant to the academic community, but also have immeasurable value and impact on broader society. Tonight's lecture was testament of the importance of the academic discourse and the sharing of knowledge. This lecture reminds us of the impact that scholarly work have on everyday life. Of course, also during such an event, it's also important to bring the thanks of our Alumni Association to you and, of course, to share a small token of appreciation from our alumni president.
Thank you.
And then, of course, a further point of thanks would go to everybody who contributed to the success of this event. The staff from the Registrar's Office, our colleagues from Communications and Marketing Department, faculty support staff, academic members. Your hard work have ensured that tonight's lecture ran smoothly. Of course, also to our technical team that provided the online assistance and the technical expertise, we thank you for a process well done. And of course, to all of you present here tonight, physically and online, your presence enriched the event. As we leave this inaugural lecture, let us also carry forward the inspiration and the knowledge that we have gained tonight. So in conclusion, please remember that an inaugural lecture is only the beginning of many discussions and academic engagements with a variety of stakeholders and publics. Processes such as these are also our affirmation that academic excellence is top priority at Nelson Mandela University. So thank you for attending tonight's lecture. And of course, after this, please do join us for some refreshments out in the foyer. Travel back safely home tonight, and we hope to see all of you at the next inaugural lecture as we progress through academic year 2024. Thank you, dankie, en kosie.